Hello, everyone. In today's video, we're going to go over three key concepts when it comes to development. The first of which is to understand the power of engaging your community when you have a question or you get stuck. The second of which is to approach problems with the mindset that something might be possible rather than from the mindset that something might not be possible. And the third is to understand that there's usually many solutions to a particular problem, and it will be helpful to have a little bit of context for how to evaluate whether a solution might be more or less useful than another in a particular scenario. So I'm going to go through each of these different key concepts and illustrate this with an example that came up yesterday where someone asked a question in the Gavel Slack community, which is free to join and very active, which was a question around if I have a workflow where I have multiple questions that are yes, no, or single select or whatever else, and I want to assign a numerical value to a positive response. How can I go about doing that in the first place? And then how could I take the scores and total them together to have a single number output for the adding of these different numerical values together? So that illustrates that first point of community and the power of doing so, which is that sometimes we can get stuck trying to figure out a problem on our own for so long when we could have just asked for help and walked away from the problem for a second, and then people could help us solve it together. So that's kind of the power of having this collective brain and knowledge where everyone's kind of pulling from their different experience to help you with your problem. So, with that, that goes into the second question, which is around, or the second concept, which is around approaching problems with the mindset that something might be possible rather than from the mindset that something might not be possible. So, when I first read this and was trying to think about a solution quickly, to be fair, it was around midnight when I saw the question because I live in London and this person is in the States. But my first point was like, oh, maybe that's possible. And then I kind of doubted myself and was like, oh, maybe that's not possible. I think they can't do it. And then so it made it harder for me to find or think of solutions when I was approaching the problem from the mindset that, oh, I don't think that's possible. And when I thought about it a little bit more, I consciously resisted the temptation to stay in that mindset and was like, what if it was possible? How might I do it if it was possible? If the answer at the end of the day that this is something that you can do with this platform, then what would that solution look like? And that was a much more positive, optimistic response. And it allowed more possibilities and ideas to come into my head about how you might go about solving this particular problem or going about providing a solution for this particular use case. So, with that, I was able to propose a solution where, in this particular instance, I said, if you had, let's say, two questions, question one and question two, what you could do to, if the point of this is to have a particular score output at the end based on positive responses. So for example, in this case, we have yes, no, and yes, no, and we are saying that yes is a positive response and no is a negative response. Same thing for this question here. In this smaller example, what you could do is create a new variable that is a text variable that is called total score. You could add invisible logic and say, if question one is yes and question two is yes, then the total score variable equals the value 2. Otherwise, if question one is yes and question two is no, then the total score is 1. Otherwise, if question one is no and question two is yes, then total score equals 1. Otherwise, if question one is no and question two is no, then the total score equals 0. So this is one way that you can do this. And if you were going to have this in an output document and you wanted to use that variable somewhere, you could just have a total score variable. In this case, you might, you wouldn't just have one piece of paper that has nothing else on it but the score. But let's say just to test to see if this works, and what we should see or expect to see is an output of 2 because we said yes and yes, then it would work. So this is a solution that would work, and in the sense that it would accomplish the goal that the question was posed to try to accomplish, which is assigning a value to a particular answer. So let's say in this case, I'm saying if the person says yes to both questions, then they get 2 points for positive responses. But if they say no to both, then they get 0 for their positive responses, and so on. So this is one way, but it could get complicated if you had lots and lots of different questions, because I'm saying you would need to add invisible logic around every single combination of things that might be possible in this particular combination. So let's say, for example, in my case, I only have 2 questions and we have to have this many sets of possible variations in order to account for all of the possible answer choices at the end. So although this is one solution, it's not necessarily going to be the best solution if we don't come up with lots of different ideas together. So in response to this, he kind of, was saying, I have like more than 20 questions. So he's like, I was thinking maybe if I had an specific value assigned to each specific question, then I could have that value added together at the end. So I was thinking, okay, well, that's a good solution as well. Even though this solution worked, I'm not so it's not precious to me. It's not so something that I have to be defensive about it being the best solution just because it was the first one that I came up with and that I came up with it. That's one of the things that we can kind of drop our ego and say, like, there might be a better solution than the one that I came up with. And so with the one that he was saying, he was really saying, what I would prefer to have happen, instead of trying to come up with all of the possible combinations for every type of question in this, which is what I'm doing here essentially, and then assigning a value at the end to that set of possible combinations, he's saying, could we just instead assign a value to the positive score for each of these questions and then add them up together? So we can do that. And I think that that's a great solution. And I think it's better than the solution that I posed. And I'll kind of go through the different solutions and why I think one is better than the other in a minute. But what you would do here instead of the way that I did it initially is that you hear I have question 1, question 2, and question 3, and we would expect that or what we want to have happen is that this would come out as 3, right? Like this. So I have 3, and that at the end, in whatever output document I have, in this case, I wanted to illustrate something in this next point. I have like the total score variable here, and then I have it in different formats. So we would expect to see 3 here. And we do. And the way that I accomplish this one is to have our questions here. In this case, they're all yes, no, but let's say you had a single select and you could choose which ones were going to be positive and so on. What I did was I had a separate invisible logic page for each of the questions, and then we gave them a number score. So I said, create new variable, number, question 1 score. And this was his idea, not mine. And I think that's a great idea. I just helped him with this part a little bit, which was around, so you would add invisible logic saying, if question 1 is yes, then question 1 score is going to equal the number 1. So for example, you would make this type number and then put in 1, and then you'd say add. And then same thing for this one. Otherwise, if question 1 is no, then I want this score to actually equal 0, the number 0. So if you're going to do this, you're going to do this for each of the questions and make sure that each one has their assigned different value. So in this case, if question 1 is yes, though that's the positive answer, then same thing, 1. If it's no, then 0. Same thing for question 3. And like I said, if you had different question types or styles, you would denote which one would be giving it a score of whatever amount, and so on. And then the last thing you would do is you would create an invisible logic page and a new variable called total score, where it's a number 1, which is going to allow us to add different operations like addition and subtraction, for example. And instead of adding any invisible logic here, you're just going to have the calculation here after the equal sign. So what we're saying is we have a number question type or variable type called total score that is going to equal question 1 score plus question 2 score plus question 3 score. So we're taking the scores that we created and we're just adding them all together. So all you'd need to do is choose your variable and say add. Then you would choose the operation, which in this case is going to be addition, and say add. Because even if something is 0 and they're going to add together, it will equal 0 if they all are negative responses, or they would add up to, in this case, 3 if everyone answered 3 for all of them. Now, in this thread, if we go back to the idea around multiple different solutions for a single posed question, is that one of my other friends from the community reached out and said, "Oh, here's another solution that you might consider as well." And this is the solution of actually just hard coding in the kind of logic here. So you're saying one, like the value of one, if question one is true, in this case, yes. Otherwise, I want it to be zero. And this is one phrase that gets added to another, where the same thing happens here for question two. The number one will be shown if question two is true. Otherwise, I want it to be zero. And so this is kind of just taking the logic that we did in a no code fashion here and turning it into a code that you could just type this out the way that you want it to be. So now we're going to go into that third piece, which is around kind of, although there are multiple solutions, you want to evaluate why you might want to use one over the other. So just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean that you should use something in a particular scenario. So let's talk about this particular scenario, and especially in this scenario where my friends or the person who asked this particular question from the community, where they have multiple, like 20 different questions that they're trying to attach a value to. So, from my perspective, I think his solution was actually the best. He just needed to get to the end of the road on it, which is like finishing out and filling the gaps of whatever he didn't quite understand, how to do it physically, how to do it in the system. So his solution of having a particular score attached to each separate question and then totaling those together, I think is the best solution of the three. And that mine is okay, but gets very complicated and it allows for a lot of room for error. So even though it still works, and it works maybe better in, or like you can still do it in things that have a lower number of possible combinations, I still think that his solution is better than this one. So it works, but it would be more complicated to set up. This one's quite easy to set up. So this one's more convoluted and could be more prone to error, and also just not that efficient when you think about it. So I think that even though you would have to have multiple pages, one for each question, this is a cleaner solution. So we're saying that this is a number that has a score that's just for question one. So if it's yes, then it's going to be one. And if it's no, it's going to be zero. And then you have a lot of control and flexibility over whether, especially if you have something like a single select where there's multiple options and two of them are positive. So you could say something like, if the single select option selected is the first one, or the second one, or the third one, then they still get a value of one in any case. Otherwise, I want it to be zero because the other choices are, you know, are less positive. Whatever the case may be, it just allows for a lot more flexibility. So I think that his solution here is very elegant, and I just helped him kind of get over the line a little bit on how to actually implement it. The third one that we had, which is around the idea of coding this solution, I think is interesting and it gives us a lot of insight into other ways of how to do something. But I think it will be less useful in the long run because you're not creating a new variable that can be used in other places when you use this method. And you're also having to type it manually, which can, if you have, let's say, 20 different questions, could lead to error. And you don't have the ability to interact with this particular one in the word add-in, for example. So the reason why I mention this is, so if we think not just in the context of the actual workflow itself, you want to think not only in the workflow, but also in the output document if you were going to have one, and also in how this would interact with future workflows that you create. So when I say that, I'm saying that because this doesn't allow you to create a variable around it, it's just showing you the output of a number from these particular math calculations. It's not going to allow you to format it with the no code word add-in. It's not going to allow you to use that variable in other places and so on and so forth. You'd have to manually code everything around this and it will be less useful. So even though all of these different solutions are valuable and all of them could be used in different ways, the most value we get from having these different solutions is one, to learn more about the platform, and two, to foster a community of open-minded ideas and accepting that maybe and understanding that people are going to approach this problem from different perspectives. So from my perspective, I was thinking of one solution. From the person who posed the question initially, they're like, I think this is the right way to do it. I just don't know how to get it to the end of the line. And then the third person was saying this kind of more coded solution. I would always be wary, though, of having a code first approach in a no code platform, because it's designed to make it to where you don't have to do this and that you can do something like this, which is still a little bit cleaner anyway at the end. So that's just to say, one of the things that I was mentioning around that understanding which solution is going to be most efficient in different scenarios is that piece around how can I use it not only within the workflow itself, but also how can I use that in the output document and other workflows in the future. So as I mentioned, the reason I say that is we can't refer to a coded solution here in the Word add-in, which makes it harder to format because you'd have to hard code in whatever format you want. So here, and you can't use it, let's say, in other logic. You'd have to hard code that in as well. So let's say, for example, that I have this solution where I have the invisible logic total score here. That means that I can go in and I can use it like any other variable. So I can go in my Word add-in, I can find this particular one, which is test total score, and I can say I want to take that variable and I want to format it as just a number, which is this case here. Or I can format this as a decimal, which I've done here, or a decimal with comma, or currency, or first letter capital, or lowercase, or uppercase, or an ordinal number. I have all these options, and I can even choose how many decimal places I want to move this if I choose decimal, for example. And then all I have to do is choose that and say insert variable, and it's going to do all of the coding for me. The other useful part about having this be a variable is the ability to use it in logic within the Word add-in as well. So here I have you scored 3 points as a phrase I want to show only if the total score is exactly equal to 3. So if I were going to do this from scratch, I'd say show paragraph when, and that has to do with spacing. So if it goes away, I want the spaces to go away as well. So in this case, I'm going to say if total score, so I can use that invisible logic variable, is, let's say, greater than or less than or equal to, and then I can say 3 or 2 or 1 or 0 or whatever else, then I can just go in and I can put whatever phrase I want to have shown. And I can say insert condition, and it's going to do all of that for me as well. So that has to do with that idea of, just wanting to make sure that we're thinking about how not only whether we can show this value in the workflow, but also how can we interact with that information or variable in the output document. And then the final piece is around how can I interact with that particular variable or solution in other future workflows. So what we can benefit from is data persistence when it comes to having a variable that is the same across different workflows. So let's say, for example, that I have this one here, total score. If I create another workflow that has to use that information for some reason, I'm going to say something like score workflow 2, for example, and I need to pull that information. If I've coded in that solution, I'm just going to put total score here. Then it will be harder for me to use that in other places. So let's say I'm going to have that be a number question here, where I'm going to say what is the total score. Then I can use total score, exactly the same variable that I had in the other one. And let's just go ahead and save this. I'm just going to update the settings really quick to have no final review page, and to customize the message to just say thank you. And then let's go into, this is just going to have one question, which is what's the total score? But I'm just going to show you how we would be able to push this information from one workflow into another. So I can take total score and whichever one I had here, let's do this one here. I can take that and I can push it into the other one that I just made, which was called, what was it called? Test score workflow 2. Let's do score workflow 2. And then we're going to push it into that one. And it's going to go all the way to the end. So actually, I'm going to go ahead and quickly update this so that we can see what it just did a little bit too fast for us to see, in the sense that, like, basically it's already completed the workflow because it already knew the answer. So it might be useful in this case then to actually show you the final review page. So let me just go ahead and quickly put that back on, because then you would be actually able to see what's going on. So in this particular case, let's try again. We'll go back to the data manager. We'll select our workflow, which is going to be total score. And we're going to choose our one that had 3. And we're going to put that into workflow 2 score here. Then we're going to see here that what is the total score equals 3. And it already auto-populated that answer for us because we already had the answer in the previous session. So that's what I was saying about how somebody can benefit from data persistence because of using that more invisible logic setting instead of doing it from a hard coding perspective, because we can use that variable in many different places now, including in the data manager. If somebody already answered that past question or workflow while they were logged into their client portal and they were taking a future workflow that asks for that information as well, it would already be populated for them. So these are the different things you want to consider when you're thinking about that last piece, which is, although there might be multiple solutions to a problem, you want to think about how you can use one over the other and why you might use one over the other. And a lot of it comes around you want to have a variable attached to these different things. So I hope that this has been a useful exercise to go through and talk about these 3 different concepts. One is that, we talked about engaging within the community when you get stuck or have a question. The second one being to have a mindset of this might be possible, rather than approaching problems from the mindset that this might not be possible. And then the third one being that although there might be multiple solutions, in most cases, there's going to be some that are more useful or efficient than others, even if it produces the same result. So I hope that was useful, and I'll see you in the next video.